All right, I think we might get started. So, welcome everyone, and thanks for joining our session today. My name is Shayla Kappelle. I'm one of the production leads at Portable, and I work alongside a team that works predominantly within transport, which is one of Portable's impact areas. I'll be hosting this discussion today. So, I'd like to start by acknowledging the Wurundjeri Wurrung people of the Kulin Nation, who are the traditional owners of the lands we are having this conversation on today. I'd encourage those of you joining from other locations to please feel free to add the lands from where you're joining from into the chat as well. We're grateful to be welcomed guests living and working on these lands that have been cared for tens of thousands of years by Indigenous people. There is a long history of Indigenous-led innovation in the fields of agriculture, technology, art, languages, and astronomy. They in particular use their knowledge of the sky to construct calendars, song lines, and other navigational tools, enabling them to navigate across the country, trading artifacts and sacred stories. We'd like to pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and we acknowledge that Indigenous sovereignty has never been ceded. It always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So we're here today to chat about technology and its role in innovating and improving accessibility in transport. And I'd like to take this opportunity now to welcome and thank our guests for joining us. So we have Charlotte Fliegner, who is the Passenger Experience Manager from Yarra Trams. We have Tricia Malowney, Chief Accessibility Advocate from the Department of Transport and Planning. And finally, also joining me from Portable today is Anthony Daff. He's one of our business directors, self-proclaimed transport nerd, who heads up the team I mentioned in my own intro, working largely in the transport space. So today we'll hear from each of our guests. We'll have a bit of a discussion and open it up for some questions. But I'll run through a smidge of housekeeping first, and then we'll get stuck in. So firstly, I just wanted to let you know that the session will be recorded. So if any reason you don't get to see the full webinar or you'd like to share it with colleagues or friends following this, it will be available on our website over the coming week. We welcome and encourage you to use the chat window as a space to introduce yourself, share thoughts, comments, have discussions with the community of participants here. And we'll be keeping an eye out for questions, comments, and requests in there. However, we will also be using the Q&A function through the presentation. So please feel free to add your questions in there, and we'll dedicate some time towards the end of this session to answer your questions. We may not be able to get through all of them, given how many people are on the session today, but we will try to address themes that come through in those questions. We've got Madison manning the Portable events, and he's in the chat and here to help. So if you have any issues, please message them directly and they will assist where they can. So I'll start us off today with Anthony, who's going to provide a quick overview of some of Portable's recent work within the transport space.
Thanks, Shayla. I'm hoping we can cover a few topics today, but let's see where this goes. I'll open by talking about three things that Portable has been working on recently. The first piece of work we've done this year was the Smarter Trams initiative, the Yarra Trams, where we're taking the location data from GPS units on trams and we're broadcasting their locations every second. We're processing locations through to the Department of Transport in Victoria for the traffic light priority system and also sending it to the Yarra Trams backend for analytics. The next topic I want to talk about is the Portable Wayfinding report, which we created earlier this year. What we did was we sent our researchers out to transport hubs in Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne, and Adelaide, and they looked at examples of modern wayfinding, finding where it works well and where it doesn't work well in those cities. And what we came up with was a set of 5 principles which we think were consistent amongst all the places which had a good wayfinding experience. The first principle is consistency. A consistent experience and accurate information across touch points and journey stages is important, especially during journeys. The next principle is simplicity and clarity. People need an intuitive experience that supports clear and distinct communication rather than complex or cluttered design. The third principle is relevancy and inclusiveness. Put humans at the centre of wayfinding design. Ensure interactions are contextually relevant during planning, transit, and when on board. The fourth principle is that communications need to be dynamic. Wayfinding support and guidance should adapt to environmental challenges and complex urban contexts to provide a reliable experience for all travellers. For instance, it's not worth saying that the trams are in this direction if there are no trams running at the moment. And the final principle is flow. The successful experience isn't necessarily faster, but it should be smoother, offering easy use and enjoyable journey for all citizens. The final topic I want to talk about is our multimodal solution. This is a product being trialled by the Victorian Department of Transport. The product puts multimodal information on screens at transport hubs. This information is to be used by people as they get off a train or get off a tram and need to traverse the last mile of their journey. And of course, we're using our wayfinding principles in the design of that product. We're also doing research in the coming weeks with real transport users, where we're trying to gain insights into their attitudes towards multimodal transport. Of course, where multimodal includes all the normal travel public transport modes, plus taxis and Ubers, hire scooters and hire bikes. And we'd like to see what, and we're particularly interested in the people who might have an accessibility issue and see what their attitudes towards multimodal are. And hopefully we can get to talk more about that later. I think that's all for me, Shayla.
Cool. Thanks, Anthony. Appreciate you running through all of that. Next up, I might hand over to Charlotte to talk a little bit about what they've been doing.
Thanks, Shayla, and thanks for having me, to the Portable team, for having me today. As Shayla mentioned, I'm in the Passenger Experience Division at Yarra Trams. So I'll speak about what we're seeing from, I guess, being within an operator environment. And as Anthony mentioned, wayfinding really is a lot more expansive than just kind of signage, which I think usually that's what wayfinding has always kind of pointed us towards, is kind of different signage and navigational options. But with Yarra Trams' partnership with Portable recently to develop the smarter trams, what that really means is that now we've got some better data and real-time information about where our trams are on the network. And the question now becomes, how do you broadcast that out to our passengers in ways that are accessible, that are multimodal, that importantly get information to a passenger in the language that they want. And so I've got some examples of how other jurisdictions are doing it, and then how we at Yarra Trams are doing that in really interesting ways. In New South Wales, Sydney specifically in New South Wales has an open data and innovation challenges, which are really interesting in the sense that they make their data open, and then we see their transport data open, and then we see some really interesting information apps coming out of that, and different ways that passengers can consume information, public transport information and data. So it's not about necessarily pushing everyone into using the Opal app, but about making that various data, public transport data and information accessible through all different types of applications, or not necessarily just digital either. Another good example is in Singapore. In Singapore, there's a chatbot called Bus Uncle. It's actually developed by a third party, so it's not by the public transport authority. But it's a chatbot that you access. You don't have to use another app. You access it through Facebook Messenger, through Telegram. And the reason I really like it is because it takes that data that that we have through submarted trams, like when your next tram is arriving, but it doesn't just push it out to people in a language that is of, say, a government or public authority language. Instead, the user asks for the information, or a citizen, sorry, or a public transport user asks for that information in their own language, and it comes back to you in a more of a colloquial language, hence why it's called bus uncle, as a kind of a colloquial term for someone who knows more knowledge or is a bit older, or an elder. I think that's a really good example, especially because you can get information to you like crowding, but it's not given to you in a way that says this tram is 98% full. Instead, you ask, is there a seat on this? And it will come back to you kind of in a playful manner of when there will be a seat or that kind of thing. So it's, again, about a different, a kind of accessibility around language, that one. At Yarra Trams, you may have seen, if you've ridden the Route 96 this year, we've been trialling something called NaviLens. So NaviLens takes that data that you'll be able to access on Tram Tracker, the Tram app, and it converts it or translates it into an audible language, so that people with low vision or no vision can access that information in real time. So NaviLens is an app that was developed in, or a technology that was developed in Spain that relies on two things. It relies on a user downloading the app called NaviLens, and codes that kind of look like colored QR codes being installed or stuck onto tram stops and onto trams. And then if you've got that app and you go to a stop, you'll be able to scan that stop, and it will pick up the code from 10 to 20 meters away. So you could do, say, a 360, and it would pick up where that code is, and it would read to you the information that you'd otherwise get from, say, Tram Tracker which would be in a visual information, but it can read it out to you. You could have headphones in and things like that. So you don't necessarily need people around you don't necessarily know that you're using this. As well, you can use it to show that information on your phone in a bigger format, that textual information on your phone in a large format. And so you can kind of scan, it tells you the next tram that's arriving, and then when you could hear a tram arriving, you could hold your phone up to the direction that tram's coming in, and it will tell you what tram it is and where it's going. And then once you're on the tram, we've got codes stuck on those trams, which are on the Route 96, which goes from Brunswick Way down to St Kilda. And it will tell you the next stops and things like that. So we've trialed that, and we've had really good uptake of it. And we've also, through that data, we've seen some really interesting things come out of it. We've seen that the highest number of say foreigners, or those who aren't residents of Australia, or who are using this, are those who've come from Spain, which indicates that this is starting to become in Europe a kind of a standard for wayfinding on public transport. And it's not necessarily just those with low vision, because the app can also use the language that your phone is set on. So if you don't speak English, for example, you could come and you could it could read timetable information to you in your own language. So it's not necessarily just about accessibility for people with low vision at all. And I think there's kind of like the open data challenges that New South Wales Transport has put out. I think once we roll this out across the network, which is our plan, we might be seeing really interesting uptake of or usage or appropriation of these kinds of technologies. How it integrates with just general wayfinding, especially at transport interchanges, how someone can navigate a public space or a complex station like Flinders Station. I think are really interesting opportunities for this type of wayfinding technology, really. Yeah, I think we'll leave questions till after, so I'll hand back to Shayla.
Cool, thanks, Charlotte, and thanks for explaining that. I've tried it myself, and it's really quite a cool tool, actually. But it reminds me of something one of my colleagues frequently says as well, that when you're designing for folks with accessibility needs, you're really designing for everyone, and you can kind of see the uptake of people being able to use a tool that has been designed for those moments of helping people with accessibility needs. But actually, you know, maybe I just do have my headphones on and I want to hear when the next stop is, or, you know, maybe I do want to transit. So, you know, like, it's really nice to be able to see that kind of coming to life in a very real way. Cool. So I will pass over now to Tricia.
Thank you. It was very interesting. I was just about to say the same thing. When you design for people with disability, you design for everybody. And that's very clear. For me, it's all about co-design. So it's no point designing something without us, because it just might not work. And I think that's the key to it, that we need to be in at the beginning, and we need to be in at all stages along the way, so that if there are any glitches, we can fix them straight away. Some of my most successful interactions have been when I brought engineers and people with disabilities into the same room at the same time, so that they're coming up with mutual solutions, so that they're fixing things on the spot, so that it's not about taking it away, showing it, and then coming back and then going, no, that doesn't work either. And I suppose the most prominent example of that is with the NGT trams that are being built at the moment. So we had a virtual reality part of that coming through, where we had people with disabilities who went in and did the virtual reality tour of the new tram. And that was my first time using virtual reality, and I really enjoyed it. Just had to be careful not to sit on the seat, because the seat wasn't actually there. It was that good. And of course, now we've got the mock-up, and we've got a number of people going out to Tullamarine to have a look at the mock-up of the NGT. But I also wanted to talk about Try Before You Ride. And we had a very successful session down at St Kilda earlier this year. And I'm not sure whether the draw card was trying to use trams, or whether it was having league footballers come along, and they were the draw card. So we all wore our footy colours to go down to St Kilda and have a look at a tram and try getting on and off the tram while it was stationary. And for some people, that was the first time they'd done that. So we had people with intellectual disabilities, we had people who were scooter users, wheelchair users, parents with prams also came along and tried it. We had people who were vision impaired, and we had people who were deaf. And we actually had a couple of tourists who just happened to be there, and they had their elderly mum with them, and she also had a go at trying to get on, and they were quite impressed that they'd be able to get their luggage on and off. So when we build again for people with disabilities, we're actually building for everybody. And it was very interesting to see people really engaged in trying it and listening to the people who were explaining things, but getting to meet staff as well. So just not knowing who did what and where they did it. And this is an ongoing thing, that people need to be able to feel comfortable in using all forms of transport. One of the things in relation to wayfinding is that we're told consistently that the information needs to be consistent across all modes of information. So if you're deaf, you need to hear what you need to be able to read what people are hearing. And if you're blind, you need to be able to hear what people are seeing. Because one of the worst things that we have is when they're told that the trams aren't running and you're still standing there while everybody else has gone. And if you're deaf, you might see a sign that says, listen to an announcement, right? Well, you can't hear an announcement. So there's also that point about just little things like knowing that the next stop and which side to get off, if we're consistent across all of that. But I think it's really important in unplanned stoppages to know what's happened and why it's happened and what happens next. So I'll stop there.
Well, thanks very much, Tricia. I really like the idea of the tribe before you ride, because I imagine there is a huge sort of resistance to kind of actually utilising public transport when you don't feel like you might be catered for in that scenario. So I think that's a really great initiative. And I think from reading, there's another one of those sessions taking place early next year as well. Which is really great that those are happening reasonably frequently for people to be able to use those, try and use those without feeling embarrassed or anything like that when trying to use all of those things. And I think as well, really nice that it is provides a way to gather insights for how those services can be improved as well. Anthony or Charlotte, was there anything that you wanted to comment on from what Tricia was talking about?
I've been to see the NGT, the new tram, the mock-up, but I definitely didn't get a VR tour of it. I'd love to see that.
Yeah, I was really pleased to do that. That was my first time, and I thought, I'm going to live my life on VR now.
Yeah.
But you know what's interesting about that too, by doing that virtual reality and then getting the same people to come out and look at the mock-up, they can actually see the things that they said needed to be changed can be changed right from the start. And so there's still opportunities, of course, because the co-design doesn't stop with co-design. It's co-implementation. I like to call it co-product management or project management, you know, so that when, because it's the evaluation as well. And some of that little fixing of the glitches that happen.
Yeah, absolutely. We talked to, or you talked a little bit, Tricia, about some of those disruptions or moments of disruption. And I was wondering if we might have a bit of a discussion on how maybe multimodal fits into that, and how maybe it can work harder for those with accessibility needs, or help them sort of overcome limitations that they might experience within that space.
Yeah, certainly. There are some really needs for some fixes in that space, you know, sort of it just needs more interconnectivity and more working together to make sure that everything works well for everybody. And I will tell you that I decided to catch a tram down the other end of town recently, and I got halfway down before I found out the tram wasn't going any further. So I had to walk the rest of the way, which is fine. But I thought, surely I should have got a personal notification to tell me there was a disruption, but apparently that doesn't happen. I'm not that important, but it is that sort of thing that sometimes you just have to change your plans, and you have to know what else is available, and not knowing what's available is the big thing. So if there is a major disruption, we've got to make sure that everybody who gets off the tram knows what their options are. Is there a bus that's going to take them if the tram isn't working? Is there a tram available if the train's not working? And is that tram accessible to all? So there's all of those things that if we have the information that enables us to make a decision quickly, it makes it easier for everybody. Charlotte, did you want to come in there? Because
yeah, for sure. We know that when passengers experience a disruption, planned or unplanned, their satisfaction levels just generally about the entire network goes down quite significantly. And so really disruptions are probably the major topic, both planned and unplanned, and how we better get information to people really quickly. I think the use of, you know, what do people perceive as a trusted channel to receive that information? Not necessarily Twitter or X or whatever it's now called, right? Like, what are people actually looking at when they're at a stop or when they're on a tram that's stopped? And how can the driver also play a part? We've had examples in Yarra tram on the trams where, you know, people with various accessibility needs have not taken a tram again after just being left without any information because it's caused such anxiety that it stopped them doing that again. We have given all of our kind of authorised officers and customer service employees and officers, they've got little notebooks that they can pull out and communicate with visual pictures with someone, and I think they're quite effective in helping someone who doesn't know what's going on and to communicate in visual ways. That I think that's a nice example of something that is really low tech, that involves maybe a culture change amongst employees and frontline employees about how they communicate, how they're aware of different needs. Not everyone's just kind of on their phones looking for, you know, the next Uber or something like that. But yeah, it's true. I think disruptions is the hot topic. And
certainly, because just about everybody in Victoria's got my phone number, I do receive calls when there are disruptions, particularly around people who may have an assistance animals, and the only alternative is for them to take a taxi, and they're denied access. You know, and then we have that when we do bring buses in, and we have to have people to guide people to those buses, that they're not always trained to understand disability and the requirements under the law to enable access for everybody. And so, you know, there's some of that, especially in the planned disruptions, where we must make sure that people understand their responsibilities as well as their rights, and that we guide people in a way that suits their needs. You know, don't assume that everybody who has a disability also has a cognitive impairment. You know, we're adults, so give us choices, and I think that's important too. But just to make sure that everybody's got the same information, and that there are choices available. And I did hear of one planned disruption, which was going to take place in the evening, where they sent the taxis home at 8 o'clock, because after all, people with disabilities don't go out at night. You know, so there were a couple of people who were stuck in getting home, ironically from the football, who just didn't have transport options available because of the assumptions that people make about people with disabilities.
We've had some good partnerships in the planned disruption space with Travellers Aid, which I should point out. And that's when we've had large disruptions, especially in the CBD, that involve, and we've had people from Travellers Aid assisting people with accessibility needs around those disruptions. They're mainly around construction works and things like that.
Yeah, and I can't underestimate the importance of Travellers Aid in supporting people with disabilities who are in a spot in the CBD. Unfortunately, they're not everywhere, but certainly in the CBD, it's a really great initiative.
Yeah.
Sorry, is my sound working? I apologise.
You're all good.
Another initiative in that area, which I really like, is I think the sunflower. Is that a Travellers Aid thing? The sunflower. So when you put an invisible disability.
It's actually bigger than that. So it was. It's been run by Sandy Facey out of Bailey House, which is a disability organisation over in Brighton Way, I think it is. And it started in England, and it was brought out for the airport. And then since then, Sandy's taken it up and she's run with it. And now we have Yarra Trams, and we have B-Line, and we have kinetic bus lines, and we have metro trains, all have taken it up as an initiative. So what it is, it's fine for me. I use calipers and crutches, so everybody will fall over backwards trying to help me. But if you have an invisible disability, such as, say, chronic pain, which doesn't allow you to stand on a tram, if you've got the sunflower, it's an indication that you do have a hidden disability. And now I notice that there are hidden disability sunflower decals going on the trams. next to the priority seats, so that people see that if somebody has a sunflower on, that they can sit in those seats, because people are reluctant to do so. I've had people say to somebody, give up that seat for me, but actually I prefer to stand on for short distances on trams. It's easier than getting up and down. So people make assumptions, but actually the hidden disabilities are a very, very large part of our community. So thanks for raising that, Anthony. I should have done that myself.
Thanks, Tricia. Oh, it looks like Anthony is having a few more technical difficulties there. I just want to take a pause to say thanks from David Simmons in the chat for correcting me there. The next Try Before You Ride event facilitated by V-Line in Shepparton on the 7th of December, and more information on the website. So thank you for pointing that out, David. We might tuck into some questions now, if you have any. So I'm just going to check. The first one that we have, which is for everyone, off the back of Tricia's reference to the power of co-design. How difficult or easy have the panelists found it to advocate for and organise co-design within your own organisations?
Well, I can start with that one if you like.
Sure.
We actually have a very good record on that, and that's something I'm proud to talk about. And I don't think that's been because of me. We have, in the Commonwealth Government has a requirement under the National Disability Strategy for co-design to be in place. Under the State Disability Plan, co-design is required to be in place. And the Department of Transport and Planning has it in their transport accessibility strategy that co-design should be in place, because it's been recognised that it does work. It makes sense. However, that doesn't mean that it's happening everywhere, because there will always be places that I can't work my way into quickly. And sometimes people will come up and say, look what we've built. Isn't it fabulous? And I say, well, yes, it's really good. However, I can't get into that. And I'll use a pretend building. So they've built a beautiful building and it's the Taj Mahal. So that's fabulous. I can't get into it. Well, we can't change it because it's got, a historic marker to it. So come to us first. Tell us what you're planning. Let's get people with disabilities in there before you build it. I don't want you to come and have to tear something down, because I use the money side of it. It's going to cost more if you have to rebuild it. So that's how I do it. I mean, my role is only to amplify the voices of people with disabilities. That's my role. And I can do that by using the frameworks that we're required to follow.
Thanks.
From a Yarra Trams perspective, I'd say our accessibility team is doing great things with co-design, and I'd probably call it more on the human-centered design part of that participation spectrum. Co-design, I'd really say, is more where those people really hold the power. At the end of the day, Yarra Trams or government, in the instances that I've been involved in, we're kind of making the decisions, but we are definitely, like, for example, the NaviLens example, we have a really strong accessibility reference group, and now we're turning that into more than a reference group. We will test down to code sizes. So every one of those labels that are stuck on a tram stop will be, as we roll it out, we'll be testing all the different iterations of where those can go, where they're best placed, what kind of information, when we trial it on as a wayfinding tool, do people want to know? Do they want to know where the miking machine is, or do they want to know where escalators are, or is it the lift? Because the lift is a lot better to take than an escalator for some people. So we'll be using it for those sorts of, as that kind of tool, and I guess, or method, and as we design NaviLens as a rollout. I still think there's loads of improvement that we can make for bringing customers or passengers in. And typically, as I've seen also in government, it's time and budget and access to people and just organising that always seen as the pain points. Yet at the end of a project, you can always see that it's probably better to invest in that up front. So it's definitely something we can keep improving on. And I think I'd really like to see co-design brought into how we think things like the language that we use, the disruption signage, that type of wayfinding. I'd really like to see co-design principles used.
David's put in the chat that the NGT is a great example of co-design. And that's the one that I brought up earlier, because it really is. It's wonderful to see things from the beginning through to the end when you actually see them coming to fruition. And people, and it's been interesting in because the Extrapolis 2 is another example of that. That's a train. It's another example where people have been skeptical about what co-design means. And then when they see their work being implemented, they go, oh, this is real. Because traditionally people with disabilities have sort of been, it's like been tokenistic. We have to do it, so let's do it. But it's also been seen the enthusiasm of the engineers, the designers, and those who are building the NGT, people actually like this. So, mind you, I get a bit over enthusiastic and want to take the mock-up home, because it's so wonderful. I love seeing what we've worked on.
Absolutely. Anthony?
Yeah, one thing, if my internet holds up, one thing I think we could possibly do better is when we've got private operators, I don't think private operators are always incentivised to, say, use human-centred design or to do co-design. That's possibly something we look at over the next few years. Is I know we incentivise our operators to, say, run the units on time and things like that, but maybe we should put in incentives in the contracts to do more co-design or to work more with people with extra needs.
Well, with that, though, I actually think people are learning that it's to their benefit to use co-design. So, I'm all for incentivising everything, that if it gets us more people with disabilities into the workplace or into roles of importance, or that we get better equipment. But I think that over time, like everything else, where it's incentivising things in the start, once it starts to happen, then we can see that it's actually, this is to our benefit to co-design. So, it's an interesting thing, isn't it? Incentivise at the start, and then it will become part of business as usual.
Yeah, becomes part of the culture. The other thing with disruptions, which I think we could incentivise a bit better as well, is connections between transport options. So I don't think there's any incentive, for instance, if you're running a tram which connects with a train and that train's running late, there's no incentive to sit the tram at the tram stop for a couple of minutes and wait for the train to arrive before moving off. And I think that's one problem with our multimodal system, certainly in Victoria, is that there's no incentive for those interconnections to work harmoniously together. That's not something we fix in this room, but that'd be a good thing to fix in future too.
We could fix it if we didn't take passengers. Our transport system would run a lot more efficiently, wouldn't it? But it is, that's across all modes of transport. Like the buses that leave just as the train pulls in, and we're getting there. We're getting there with that, and I think that our operators are starting to work together to, we have all of our operators come together with all of their disability reference groups at the end of the year for International Day of People with Disabilities, where we talk about the issues of concern for all of us. And I can tell you that the issues are the same, doesn't matter what mode of transport you use. So there is that opportunity there, and maybe that's an incentive that needs to be brought up into the future. I don't know. I'm not into the working side of things. I'm only into the talking about things side of the business. So I don't actually have to do anything that I suggest.
Can I
Charlotte,
just add to that?
yeah.
We've seen some good examples where even though the timetable isn't necessarily coordinated so that when one mode arrives, the other mode departs a few minutes later, at least we've seen some good examples, especially say in Madrid urban buses. I know in Germany, of course, it's always Europe that has the good examples of where at least there's real-time information on a mode about the other modes. So we're seeing that a little bit here at major train stations where you get off the train and you can see when the next tram departs. But if it's truly multimodal and supporting people having the autonomy of choice, we're really seeing that information best on a display screen on the actual carriage. So on board a tram, and then at the next stop, these are your 3 or 4 next departing buses or trains. And so that, and especially when then one's disrupted, you could navigate using that type of information.
And there's also too that with that there's, you know, as more people are using apps, it'd be great if we could have real-time information on all of the apps having the same information, or having one app that we could all go to. I mean, and I know that these are things that everybody's thinking about and working on, but to definitely have, so if I'm on a tram and I know that I've got to catch a train and I get a ping that says, you know, I can put it into my journey planner and it gets a ping saying that train's running a little bit late. But the other thing to actually have on there, whether when I change modes, that there will be an accessible tram that's the next one that's coming. So we do have that on our PIDs, on our tram stops now, that we know that the next one's going to be an accessible tram. It'd be good to know if the stop that you're stopping at is accessible as well. So we still have a number of tram stops that aren't accessible. So it's no point getting on a tram if you can't get off at the other end. So those things are also the things that we need to know, or to know that when you get off the train and you know you've got to catch a tram, that the tram stop that you're getting on at is an accessible one, or that there are alternatives or alternative modes of transport that you can use.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it's really good you bring up sorry, we're out of time. Sorry, Shayla.
No, you go, carry on.
Bringing up whether we have multiple apps or a single app, and I find it really interesting that New South Wales has said, look, we'll have as Charlotte talked about, we'll have the central data repository and people can use whichever app they feel most comfortable with. Whereas so far in Victoria, the thing's been saying, hey, let's more consolidate around the PTV app, and that'll be the do everything app. And it's really interesting to explore those two models, and I think it's good that the two states have gone in a different direction, and you can sort of see what the strengths and weaknesses of each of those are. And I think that's a really interesting, a really interesting almost experiment between the two states.
And it'd be interesting to see whether they've used co-design principles in designing those two, whether they've actually thought about including the accessibility features from the start. And I know that in Victoria they have, but whether they've done that interstate would be interesting. I'd be surprised if they haven't. I mean, it's not a competition, although it is, but it's not a competition between Victoria and New South Wales. It's making sure we get the best for all of us.
Yeah.
Just to follow on briefly from this kind of conversation, there was a chat that Natalie sent through. Natalie, I think you're only messaging the hosts and panelists, so I can see it, but everyone else can't. But I just wanted to, Agree with Anthony regarding the incentivising operators. Tricia's comments regarding co-design with us throughout the process. There's a lot of evidence that shows true innovation comes from people who don't use a product or service. What appetite is there for operators like Yarra Trams and the Department of Transport to explore this?
Well, certainly we're looking at that, who aren't using the services, who are the people who are too afraid to use our transport services, or who have just been discouraged from it. So certainly it's something we're looking at. Charlotte, what about you?
I haven't seen any research done to date from Yarra Trams, but maybe it has, I just haven't seen it. But yeah, it's a really good point. I would say that we do know that, like, completely disregarding any other parts of the passenger experience, we know that reliability and frequency of service are the two most important factors. So if we were to do research for people who maybe they live far from a reliable and frequent service and those sorts of things, yeah, I think it would bring up all different solutions, like we've seen, first stop, last stop buses and those kinds of things, which I think, yeah, where that type of research would really be relevant.
I'm off overseas in March for my Churchill Fellowship, and I'll be looking at end-to-end journeys for people with disabilities. So, and it is that first mile, last mile. What happens when you get off the tram? What happens when you get off the train? How do you get to the train station? How do you get to the tram stop? What if you lived in an outer urban areas where there's very little access to transport? And I know that in London they have Dial-A-Ride, which is a bus that'll pick you up from your house and take you to the tram stop, the train stop, the shopping centre or the doctor service and back home again. And it just runs within your local area. But it's only available to people over the age of 85 and those with registered disabilities, whatever that means. So it's sort of a very narrow scope. But I want to look at those things. I'm really interested in the experience for passengers and how people manage to get to that first stop, last stop. So I'll be in the USA, Canada, France, England and Ireland. So I'll still be working though. I can call in from anywhere.
What a lovely little trip.
I know.
We do have a question here that kind of circles back a little bit. Anthony, you mentioned before around some of the challenges of coordinating with trams and trains and delays and those kinds of things. So another question here, what are the main challenges in developing effective multimodal networks, especially in regions with high administrative fragmentation of the transport sector?
Yeah, it's a good question. Look, I think that where there is fragmentation, it has to be driven from the top. I think DTP have to take, in Victoria, would have to take the lead, or Transport for New South Wales and New South Wales have to take the lead in pushing that down to the fragmented providers. I think that's particularly difficult with buses, where we've got a bunch of different bus companies running buses in different towns, and then getting the consistency amongst all of that is a real challenge. So it's a good problem to think about. I'm not sure I've got the solution to that, but it's a really good and important problem to tackle.
And I've just moved into the bus space. So I've been talking to a few of our bus providers. And it's an interesting thing because the buses are so different to our other franchisees, because what we have is we'll have a bus that's owned by mum and dad because there's no other form of transport. And there's also the issue that school buses don't come under DSAP, the Disability Standards for Accessible Public Transport, which means that you'll have a bus that's not accessible to people with disabilities, and it's hard to get that changeover because there's a life of a bus, and then how do we make sure that the next bus they buy is accessible when there's no requirement for it to be accessible because they're actually for the school run? And the other problem is that sometimes the buses are owned by the school system, and so therefore they don't have to be accessible, and then sometimes they're available during the day for everybody else, and sometimes there's not. And then we've got the community transport, which is another set of things too. I mean, you know, if I had a magic wand, I'd fix it all. But I am talking to the bus companies, and a lot of them don't have disability reference groups and haven't even thought of it. But I've planted the seeds. Kinetic does. That's our biggest bus provider. But you know, it's really difficult because these aren't conversations that they've had before. Often the bus companies have been family-run companies. So even now, most of the employees at the top level are members of the family who founded it. But if I can, and I have got to them and said, you know, this is another way of doing things. So we're working on it. It is a work in progress. And of course, because I'm a free resource to them, it sort of means that they're happy to talk to me.
I think we have some really good examples of accessibility initiatives and that need to be shared across, for example, the new linear maps in the metro trains and the newer trains. I want to see those in the new trams, you know, like I think Trish talked about co-design and co-production. What about the evaluation against not just performance metrics, but also against those metrics that people like Trish will put into a evaluation framework, and then those things that are performing really well against those kinds of metrics can be, you know, replicated across, because it's it's a bit frustrating to see a really good example of something like a visual display and then see the opposite of that 90% across the network.
And I will tell you that people with disabilities have made those suggestions. You know, this works well there. Why isn't it working well here? And there's no reason it can't, because we're not nobody's in competition with each other. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
We're doing different things with the same outcome. And so, that's a great idea. Sharing the information is excellent.
Yeah, it really goes back to that kind of consistency across all of those services, doesn't it? And making those things easy to consume and easy to understand.
For sure.
We've probably only got time for one more kind of shorter question. So, or maybe not a shorter question. This is probably a can of worms question, but what are the key features of an accessible journey planner, and how can it be tailored to meet the needs of users with different types of impairments, especially physical?
Well, consistent, you know, is the one thing. Integrated is another part of it. Real time, right? So you know, and I don't think we need to reinvent anything, because I always like to think of Google Maps. You know, sorry, it's not a plug for Google. It's just that when I'm driving down the freeway, it'll tell me there's an accident up ahead. Right? We should be able to do that. So if I'm using Google Maps on my app, and I've put in it, it's got a Google planner, so it's knowing that I've got to go from the tram and catch the train. It should be able to tell me that I need to go to such and such a platform. It should know that my train to Ringwood, where I live, needs to be go to platform 3 or whatever it is. And then I've got 10 minutes to get there for the tram, and it should be able to know my requirements. So I'm a slow walker, because calipers and crutches slow you down. So it's no point saying it's a 3-minute walk, when for me that's a 10-minute walk. So it needs to be intuitive. So, you know, like, as we know, if I talk about a refrigerator in my house, next thing you know, I've got an ad for a refrigerator on my iPad and my phone coming up all over the place. So it should know if I'm going to the same place all the time at the same time. It should be able to be intuitive enough to tell me that it's going to be late or it's coming in early. So these are sort of wish list things, but I think they're doable.
Absolutely. Any thoughts from yourself, Charlotte, on that one?
I don't know. This is a big question. I'm not sure what more to add, to be honest. In
No,
two
no,
minutes,
that's
in
fine.
2 minutes.
Yeah, like I said, it's probably a bit of a can of worms that I finish on, but that's totally fine. And so we might wrap up there to save us going over. So I'd just like to say thanks to Charlotte and Tricia for joining us today to have this conversation. I think it's a really important discussion to be having and to be having ongoing. And thank you for everyone who's joined us today, everyone who's asked questions or participated in the chat. And a few closing bits. So an email will be going out to all of the attendees following this, so you'll be able to get the recording and things like that. For us, feel free to connect with us through our website or on LinkedIn. And last but not least, if you happen to be in Melbourne next Wednesday, Portable is hosting neighbourhood drinks. So please come along, meet a few people, take a look at a few of the products we'll be showcasing, might have a little glimpse of the multimodal solution that we're working on. There should be a link in the chat upcoming with a few of the details for that. So we'd love to see you all there, and thanks again.
Can I just say how lovely it is to have somebody joining us from Texas, USA?
Yeah, amazing.
Woohoo. Yeah. And unfortunately, I'll be in Indonesia next week and won't be able to attend. What a shame.
Oh, just so sorry for you. Oh, how cool. We'll have a great time in Indonesia. Thanks again, everyone, for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, everyone.